Okay. And by the way, I didn't know that. I didn't know that there was another way to interpret the killing of the firstborn, or the sacrifice of the firstborn. I didn't know there was another way to interpret that part. I always assumed that was the literal part, until I did a deep dive and see that in even the most ancient traditions, that part wasn't taken literal. It's supposed to, and Christians and Catholics have a both and, not so much an either or interpretation, which is that will take both a literal and the symbolic stance. But even from the oldest traditions, there was an idea that there's a symbolic message or an analogy being presented here against the idols, the false gods of Egypt, the corrupted messages from the fallen messengers that surrounded Egypt. Hey, this Ramon channel is Alpha 4, and this is Answering Grr. Today he wants me to answer Exodus chapter 12, verse 29. Let's check that out. I'm just going to read the whole paragraph. Then the people knelt and bowed down, and the Israelites went and did exactly as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And so at midnight, the Lord struck down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, as well as all the firstborn of the animals. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was loud wailing throughout Egypt, for there was not a house without its dead. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the history of this book, this chapter. So Exodus itself is about 2 or 3 different sources compiled into one source. And the reason why it was compiled and put into the Bible was because the priestly class was trying to get rid of a Canaanite celebration that fell in between or near 2 different Jewish celebrations. And these 2 celebrations needed an origin story. So what the Jewish people did is they took 3 different traditions, maybe 2. They took a story about Aaron and they took a story about Moses, and they have this kind of genetic oral traditions, genetic memory of leaving Egypt. The Hebrew people were actually in Egypt long before there was an Israel. It's in real history. It's mentioned on a stela or something like that. And they also have a memory of Ramses II. So they combine this ancient tradition that had survived through oral renditions. In fact, the story itself could have been as late of an addition as 2 Kings, but more than likely it's just simply either written at the same time of or written just after Deuteronomy and Numbers. The other issue is that they're talking as if the festival already exists and as Israel already exists. Well, if they're talking as if the name, which had not yet been settled, was already in existence, then that means that it was written after that name existed. Get it? The legalistic reason why they changed it is not as dramatic, obviously, or as interesting as the actual story, but the genetic memory they're talking about can still be a real event. The Jewish people who lived in Egypt under Ramses may have remembered a plague, and the longer, older story of the militaristic or mercenary tribes, kind of nomadic tribes that served under a pharaoh, those 2 memories would have combined into a very interesting story, and we can find historical evidence for these. That's why the plagues, if you go into the stories, that plagues actually change in different books. There's a reason for that, because this is an oral memory, but we can find times when Jewish people were in Egypt and what events were going on, and so it's very easy and very plausible that one thing that they remembered was a plague. Maybe not as severe as what's being reported here, but that's actually going to go to my next point. The Jewish people have an understanding here that this lesson is not for the wicked son, it's for the good son. So, and this kind of goes into how you're supposed to interpret it. it's the parents' responsibility to prepare the child, here a son, for how to understand this story. The story is not meant to be an entry story like it is for Christians. It's actually meant to be taught after the child has been prepared to understand the context of the story and what the story is teaching. An interesting point that we'll get to is that in rabbinic tradition, even though they take this story as an actual historical event, not all the details in the story are meant to be taken literally. So something rarely addressed in Christian circles is the Jewish understanding of this story. For one thing, it's not so much the story of Pharaoh, and it's more the story of the Jewish mastery of time. I know that sounds a little weird, but this is the Jewish people emerging into the historical record. They're not yet in the historical record. That won't happen until we get to Saul, David, and Solomon. We have to get there first before we're on recorded history. But there will be events along the way in Genesis that get to recorded history, such as Kadesh and certain things like that. So that's very important. Instead of them being recorded as slaves or as those who work, as those who are citizens for another nation, here they're coming into their own. And that goes more into the theme about what this story is and is not about. This story is not about the punishment of the Egyptian people, nor is the main point of the story the death of the firstborn sons, though those are elements and themes in the story. In fact, Christianity will draw much from the idea of the firstborn sacrifice and an unblemished lamb, and a lot of these themes, such as the wafer and all of that. A lot of that stuff comes out of the story or is drawn from the story and combined with other elements in the Old Testament. But that's a Christian typology. We like to view it through a thing called typology. So the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, the type of bread that's used, the flattened bread that represents the Eucharist. There are many elements in the story that have to deal with typology of Jesus. But because of that, we end up forgetting or putting aside the Jewish interpretation. And in the Rambam or the Shemesh, you'll see that even in the earliest traditions, surviving traditions, I should say, there were symbolic interpretations. Now, that isn't to say that the Rambam is looking at this as a purely metaphorical story. That's not what it is for them. All truth, but a polemic with some elements of truth and also some epic inserted in. Epic is what Christians and theologians is the word that we use instead of mythology. The other word is also analogy. Analogy and typology go together. Anyway, let's get back into the punishment aspect. So, a lot of modern readers who look at neither the traditional Jewish view or the Catholic view will see the plagues as some kind of punishment on Egypt. And while there is a way to look at it that way, that's not really what's going on. First off, if it was punishment, the punishment wouldn't be on the children that died. They would be dead. There wouldn't be any suffering for them. In the Jewish understanding, there's no hell. There's a Sheol, but there's no internal punishment, and these children would be innocent anyway. There's not the Christian idea of hell there. There isn't the modern idea of death being a punishment, because in the ancient world, the death rate for babies, for newborns, and for young children was very high. Survival rates were very low. So the plague could be purely metaphorical, and it could just be talking about, early infant death and all that kind of stuff. Sudden infant death. But that's not what this is. What this is that it's a punishment on the guardians. That's the stewards of Egypt. The first sons of Egypt is coded language for the idols of Egypt, or the gods of Egypt, or the guardian angels of Egypt. specifically the guardian angel of Egypt. So what it is that these are the fallen angels being punished, or angels who have lost their way and given false messages. So this would be fallen angels, or corrupted messengers, or corrupted messages. And these messages are being destroyed in front of the worshipers that worship these messages. So the people being punished here are going to be the officials and those who teach these demonic ways, for if you want to use modern Christian language. And he's going to show them this punishment by destroying their firstborn sons. But firstborn sons is like the sons of God. So these are the angels. These are the spirits and gods and idols of Egypt being destroyed in front of their worshipers. And the people who are being punished here are those who either A, actively persecuted the Jewish people, or those who enjoyed the suffering of others in general. And again, even in the oldest Jewish traditions, not all aspects or details of the story are literal. Even though in the ancient Jewish tradition, they would have viewed it as a real event. I know that's hard for modern audiences to understand, but genre is really important in ancient texts, and it's possible to relay actual history in the guise or in the pill of mythology. A teaspoon of sugar helps the medicine go down. You code this information in a story so that way it continues to be transmitted throughout history and time, so that way you don't forget it. It's also why these stories are actually sung. A lot of modern Christians don't know this, but this is actually supposed to be sung. And when you're singing, it'll help you remember the details of the story. So you recite it in a chant. Here's where the rubber hits the road. I know that for you, Grr, this is, oh, God kills the innocent children of Egyptians. But you have to understand that whether you believe in God or not, babies die every day. People have cancer every day. Sudden infant death syndrome happens every day, all the time. So, like I said, there's multiple stories being told here at the same time. There's multiple lines of transmission. So, in one of the versions, God himself is the one who does the killing. Is the one who chooses who lives and who dies. And that's to show God's will, or God's control of all things, including nature. And we'll get into that in a second. But there's also a version where it's the angel of the Lord, or the angel of death, who's doing this. And so that's just more of a metaphor for death in general. But again, that's discounting the fact that in the original understanding, this is purely a story against idolatry. It's speaking against the firstborn sons of Egypt. Well, the firstborn sons is coded language for idol, angel, and demon. If you read the Rambam or the Shemesh, you'll see that even inside every home, the firstborn son of Egypt, the idols inside the homes were not safe. That's how you know that it's talking about idols. Because in every home, the firstborn son died. Well, in the houses that were marked, the plague passed them over. So how could there be a foreigner to have died in a home that was passed over? Because the idol was still destroyed. Okay. And thus, by destroying his gods and the things that the Pharaoh hold true, remember, his heart was strengthened. His resolve was strengthened by God. Not his heart was hardened, but his resolve was strengthened. His heart was given strength, given power. Well, his defiance then broke. He already asked Moses to pray for him or bless him multiple times, but now his defiance, his arrogant defiance, was broken. But only temporarily, only long enough for the Hebrewic people to be set free. So the point of the story is that God saves, and trust in God is rewarded. But not that one that any one action or one sign saves you. It has to be through grace. So you have to go about the fearless slaughter of ancient Egyptian gods in the witness of their worshippers. And this was the call, this was the command that was given. And it is given from two perspectives, from the perspective of God and then from the perspective of Moses. So you hear it in two different ways, because this is going to become a ritual and it's going to be a celebration. It's going to overtake the spring equinox celebration in Canaanite, and it's going to be replaced with these two different Jewish celebrations from two different Jewish traditions. One a priestly tradition and one older Semitic tradition from the early Hebrews who were in Egypt. The Hebrews, the Jewish people in Israel, who are using the term Israel in this story, and they're using festival names and month names that again did not exist until later. They're inserting these ideas back into this older story of Moses. Okay, and they're being combined into one story so they can combine these two festivals, and that way these two festivals can overshadow and in a way replace the Canaanite Spring Festival, which is something that many atheists like to accuse Christians of doing with the whole Easter thing. Well, Easter, the Christian Catholic Easter, Jesus, that's actually coming and taking the place or overshadowing in this same tradition the Passover. The new Passover lamb is Jesus. But if you don't trust what I'm saying, go read the Chumash. Okay? It's in there, it's spelled out. Learn Jewish history. Learn how Jewish people actually interpret their own texts. The moral of the story is that God controls nature, and God has power over nature, and that these nature or natural elements in and of themselves are not gods, and therefore should not be worshipped or should not have idols of them made to be worshipped. That's what this is doing. That's what this is saying. That's why the 12 plagues are there, because the 12 plagues represent 12 very powerful gods in the ancient Egyptian pantheon of this time period of when this story was either originally told or first written down on paper. Either way, this is a Jewish understanding of Egyptian culture, and they're in a polemic style showing that the gods of the Egyptians will turn against them. The fertility goddess will turn against them and cannot be trusted and cannot be relied on. The Nile River, which is their source of food and flood, cannot be trusted. That all of these things, ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses, are powerless. They're empty statues, and the natural elements that they are supposed to represent, well, those are all controlled by God. That's what this story is explaining to not just the Jewish people, but to the foreigners in the Jewish land. And therefore the foreigners must follow these festivals when they're in the Jewish land, when they're in the Israelite territory. And we're talking about the Egyptians who live among the Israelites. But it's important to note that, as I said, this is the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. This is their exodus from being a footnote in someone else's history, from being a footnote in a stela, from them not controlling their own destiny, from being part of another culture's history to now being part of their own history. That's what this is. This is them emerging into the world stage. That's why Exodus, not Genesis, is the start of the Jewish religion. Genesis was written or compiled or recorded or added to the Bible later after Exodus. And Exodus was written around the same time or a little bit later than Numbers and Deuteronomy. I know that's controversial for any atheist who grew up as a Protestant and never heard this. So if you're an ex-Protestant and you're an atheist, yeah, this sounds like something that would shake your faith. But that's because you were never taught this when you were hearing these stories for the first time. This is not a story that ever shocked me or completely drew in all my interest. I found the movie interesting, the cartoon, but I never did a deep dive on this story before, or this line before, and I'm glad that you asked this question, Grr, because otherwise I would not have looked into it this deep. But I can tell you that this is a story about the emergence of a national consciousness among the Jewish people, among the Israeli people. This is not a story about the death of the firstborn. That's an element, an incidental, a thing that happened in the story, but it's not the main point. And there are other ways of interpreting that event than literal. You can see more of this in the fact that the obligation to celebrate these festivals goes beyond just the Israeli people. It also goes to the fugitives and foreigners who live in the land of Israel. And the other message in this story is that both the righteous and the wicked have to deal with temporal consequences and have to suffer tragedy and get reward. It happens to both sides. It rains on both the rich and the poor. The sun shines on both the good and the evil, okay? That's the message throughout the Bible over and over and over again. And this is the same message. It's saying that, yeah, innocent people die. Good people make mistakes. Weak people sometimes win. It's a call for the Jewish people to withdraw from error and to accept docile submission to God. There's this great line in the Shemesh that I have to share with you that I hope I include in the final edit of this video. The later writers assume a state that before it existed, and that this nation is born, and I'm reading from a quote here, and this nation is born of fallen degradation, rebirthed free. I'm going to read that again because that was really hard to say. A nation born of fallen degradation, rebirthed free. That's the quote of the Shemesh of what this is talking about. Okay, so, and I'm gonna close it up here. So it's saying that even in Judaism, you can forfeit your rights by breaking your covenant. And all of this is within the context of an ancient tradition that reflects on ancient kingship rights of safe travel within the city walls of your own kingdom. So if God's around, you don't want to do anything offensive. So you want to stay indoors, you want to say your blessings, you want to mark yourself as belonging to God, and you want to be silent. You want to let God pass. It's a message of fear and trembling, something that Kierkegaard would understand very well. Grr, there's so many of these that you have me answer, and this is going to take a little bit longer than my normal 20 minutes. Hopefully I can edit it down. You're wrong on these, and you're going to continue to be wrong on these. I'm going to ancient sources. I'm not going to like some new understanding that's somehow gonna trick you. These are the original understandings of the church fathers, of the Jewish rabbis, of whatever ancient tradition 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, however long ago this was first interpreted. I'm giving you ancient understandings of these texts back from the beginning, back from when we first started writing notes on these. And it doesn't say what you say it says. And I'm not going with like, oh, this is what Catholics say, or this is what Christians and this specific religion says. No, I'm going with what the people who wrote it and first interpreted said it meant. The original audience and the original author intent is saying something very different than what you're claiming. Peace, like, and subscribe. Talk to you all later.